Labor Day weekend, 1979. Getting a propane delivery at Echo Lake, and on top, because in the springtime is the time of year you can easily get snowed in on top. And so if you leave your propane tanks full and you happen to get snowed in, you're not going to freeze to death and you can cook some food.
Were people living up there year-round at that time?
No. Mount Evans was always sometime in June to Labor Day weekend. The state would always close the road at Summit Lake on Labor Day weekend, pretty much no matter what. So it was Labor Day weekend. I believe it was the Monday of Labor Day weekend. And Barb, via a two-way radio transmission that we had between the Sheriff's Department and the Crest House and other things, asked me if I needed propane, and I said, as long as they're there, send them up. And they did. So the fella came up. What we didn't know is he'd really never delivered propane before, but he had been told how to deliver propane. And he filled the tanks at Echo, gets to the top. We're open. A young lady named Kathy Carroll was taking out a bag of trash to a truck that we were keeping it in, and when she returned, she said, "Pew, that garbage stinks." And I said, "That's not garbage, that's pro." And that was about the time the big explosion happened. I didn't get out to finish the word propane. And it was a thunderous boom. Everybody's eyes were as big as saucers. I had probably 10 people in the cafe, and I don't know how many in the gift shop, plus my crew of about 5 or 6. And I peeked out the door, and the propane delivery fellow was running around the corner of the building saying, "Get him out of there, you're on fire." So I just turned around and announced to the building we had to evacuate, get in your cars and drive down the mountain. There was one fella that was there. I said, pull the chain at Summit Lake so nobody else can come up. I got on the Sheriff's Department radio, which we had with Clear Creek County, and said, send the fire department, we're on fire, and left the microphone swinging. And we got my crew out and my dog, and I locked the door behind me. And in the meantime, in the south side of the building, that propane tank was acting like a flamethrower, blowing a stream of fire onto that rock wall that would go over the top of the roof. It was coming out. Propane comes out at, I believe, 80 pounds when it comes out of the tank. And the fellow that was driving the truck was saying, I'm burned, and I couldn't see any burns on the guy. I was an EMT, so I was fairly cognizant of what to look for. But he had cold burns from this propane. When propane escapes into the atmosphere, it evaporates, cools down to about 20 below zero. So there's no dealing with it. 20 below, your hands won't last long. And he got freeze burns. I got him a ride down with somebody. He was uncomfortable, but he was okay. Got him a ride down, and I don't really know what happened to him afterwards. He had propane poisoning, which I didn't know you could get, and also some freeze burns. And of course, he was attempting to hook that hose back on. Then the next order of business was to try to get that propane truck out of there, because it was backed up against this flaming inferno, if you will. And I had to get it disconnected and pull it out of the way so it didn't blow up in the flames. And my crew by this time had run to the end of the parking lot and gone up on the hill a little ways to watch what was going on. We stayed up there, and all the tourists were gone. And we just pretty much watched her go down. The flames melted the glass out of those bedroom windows, and the wind was blowing. And once the glass was gone, it was a wooden roof, and we were having a new roof put on it at the time as well. And and I just had a new wooden ceiling put in the cafe as well. And once it got in there, the wind just took that thing and it burned it right down to the basement, right through the roof, through the flooring where the coffee shop was, and clear into the basement. My brother-in-law, Gene Day, was the first fella up. He was at Clear Creek Supply. When he heard the call, he went right down to the fire department. He brought up a old Dodge Power Wagon that they must have had built pretty good, because Gene nobody would believe this time. It was, 33 miles, and Gene made it in like 30 minutes in a 1960-something Dodge four-wheel drive Power Wagon fire truck. But that was, like I say, it must have had a good engine. Gene was the first on the scene, and the other trucks, and they responded from Evergreen, from Dumont, from Idaho Springs, maybe even Empire, came up there, but they were all heavier because they were carrying water, and they arrived much later. The Forest Service came eventually. But there was nothing to be done. It was already gone. And Gene hooked onto my two trucks that I had up there, and we pulled them away from the building because the paint was starting to bubble and the taillights were melting out of them. and over on Pikes Peak, my family also ran the Summit House on Pikes Peak, and over on Pikes Peak, on the north end of the Summit House, the kids, that was the gift shop, and the kids in the gift shop got a hold of my dad and said, Bill, should there be black smoke rolling off the top of Mount Evans? Well, the answer obviously was no. So my mom and dad headed from the top of Pikes Peak down to the top of Mount Evans, and they arrived just about the time that we were rolling up the hoses and getting out of there. And my dad rolled up to me. I was a little bit downtrodden at that point. And my dad rolled up to me, rolled down his window, and handed me a bag of marshmallows. I didn't think it was funny.
I mean, yeah.
but I look back on it and it was hysterical, and just sort of a good insight on who my father was. He was a good guy. And then there wasn't much to do. There was a fella that had walked up. We were leaving, and come on, you got to get in the car and go down with us. No, I want to be here to dig through the ashes. And no, that's not a good idea. No, I'm going to stay. So no choice but to leave him. So we left him up there. And when we went up the next morning, we see him walking down, and he had a bandolero like the Mexican cowboys in the movies had with their bullets, crossed across his chest, except he had coffee cups that he dug out of the ashes and found some wire, and he had all those coffee cups he was heading out with. And
that's about all you could find?
That other than some mugs that didn't burn because they were ceramic, the only thing we found was that young lady, Kathy Carroll, found her wallet inside of her purse. The purse was burned up, but her wallet was okay, so she still had her ID, things like that. But that was the only thing we could find in those ashes. And it was a wreckage. It was steel and molten glass and donut fryers and refrigerators and bunk beds and counters. It was a mess to dig through. So we hired Palace Construction to come up and do the debris removal. I kind of spearheaded that effort. I was very involved. It was something I wanted to do my whole life, was rebuild that building. Never got it done, but I loved Mount Evans and the Crest House so much that I coordinated that demolition effort. All I really did was drive the truck to the Empire dump at night. The guys would go up and cut and load the trucks and bring them down to Echo, and then so we could keep the project moving fast, I would do the dump at night, and so they'd have a fresh truck to go up in the morning and haul some more stuff out. And the thing I told them to look for, this crew that did it, was 1979, and for whatever reason I was reading all these articles about how silver was going to go high, and so I had ordered a lot of sterling silver charms, several years supply, had them in a little parts cabinet, and those guys found so I told them to look for it, and they found it. And so the only thing I have left of the Crest House is a floorboard that these guys salvaged for me, and then they put my little silver molten glob, which has bighorn sheep and the state map and miners and mountain goats and wagon wheels, all this stuff out of sterling silver burned. But it's cool.
That's pretty cool.
And that's my souvenir. And the only other thing that I really remark about was we had the week's receipts. In other words, it was all cash in those days. Week's receipts that burned up in that fire, which was hard. I knew exactly where it would was, and I wanted to go in and rescue them, but there was no way. That's where the fire started. And then I tell everybody that I lost everything I owned that day. I was a young man and traveled with all my stuff, and lost everything I owned, including my job. And, so that was about it. Beyond that, then came the cleanup, which I talked about, and then it was, what are we going to do? Let's get back into business. And that required a court case with the gas company. This was a company called Empire Gas out of Lebanon, Missouri. And a guy named Robert W. Plaster was the president and founder and owner of Empire Gas Company, and one of their affiliates was Empire Gas of Evergreen. And that's who was delivering the propane. That's who sent a young man who was told how to deliver propane but never shown. And so what that fella did, there was 2 hoses involved in filling this tank, and that was an old tank from the late 1930s, and it filled on the end. You'll notice now that what he did was he filled the first tank and then disconnected those hoses, put them on the ground, and when he put them on the ground, he scooped up a bunch of gravel that was out there. When he hooked those hoses up to the second tank, that gravel was injected into the valves, if you will. You're supposed to shut the propane off at your truck, then bleed your hoses, and that way you know that there's nothing malfunctioning, that those valves have done their job, they've closed, because that propane is pumped into those tanks via a pump. And you're supposed to bleed that fill hose off, and then if you bleed that hose off, you know that there's no back pressure. That's the step he missed. So he spun those hoses off. That valve was being held open by that gravel that he picked up. There's a primary and a secondary valve in there. There's actually two valves that closed for safety. Both of them were being held open by rocks. That we took those valves out after the fire the next day. You could see the rocks in them. I mean, it was evident. But Empire Gas knew that they had a problem, and of course, these were the years of high interest rates, and they would just reserve those losses, and the longer you could fight it off, the more interest you collected on your reserve. And it was 7 years that they delayed us before we got to court. And I believe it was Judge Kerrigan that we were but an hour into the trial with Evergreen Gas when the judge looks at those valves and looks at the pictures and looks at the audience, if you will, and said, "What are we doing here? It's very plain what happened." And the lawyers for Empire Gas knew it was over. They settled with us. All we ever got out of it was the cleanup money. It was $60,000. That's why. We didn't even get that. The Forest Service got that. We got our inventory out of it. That was it. And
so they didn't have to pay to rebuild?
They did. They settled after Mount Evans Company versus Empire Gas won. The Forest Service settled for their fee, which was $600,000, I believe, on the courthouse steps that day because they knew they were done. So they settled with the Forest Service on the courthouse steps, literally right after our trial, supposedly. Well, now this is I forget what year that was where the Empire settlement was. I think it was 7 years later. Well, then it was like, okay, now we have the money. It's 7 years later. Building costs have gone up quite a bit, but let's get busy rebuilding the building. Well, there'd been a change in administration in the Forest Service. I had plans. We drew up mutually with the Forest Service to rebuild the Crest House, a few modifications, but using the same footprint. The new fella didn't like this project. It had been turned into wilderness. Mount Evans had been turned into wilderness about this time. For whatever reason, he didn't think that a tourist shop belonged in the wilderness, even though it had been established since 1939 to 1979. The Colorado State Highway 5 was excluded from the wilderness area. I think it's 40 feet on both sides of the center line of the highway is not wilderness, so it's truly not a wilderness area, either the corridor or the summit. There'd never been any real problems on Evans with having a building up there with the tourists, yada yada. But it was just they didn't want to do it. So we said, yeah, we should. So it's called the APA, the Administration Procedure Act, or something. There's all sorts of with the NEPA. I don't even remember it all now, but we appealed. They did an environmental assessment. They called it an EA, and it came back, 5 different alternatives, and we picked number 1, which is to do nothing, not rebuild. We appealed that. That took years. Came back again. Let's do nothing. We don't want to rebuild. Then it was a lawsuit. So then we had to sue the Forest Service to rebuild the Crest House, because the law says if they collect money, that the money should go back to the cause of the action or something like that. In other words, if you collect money for a building, you should replace that building. Now, the backstory on the building was that it was built finished in 1939, built by 3 fellows from Colorado: Quig Newton, who was a mayor of Denver, a guy named Terrell Davis, and I believe there was a law firm called Newton Drinkwater Davis at one time. These were prominent Denver families. And then Thayer Tutt from the Broadmoor Hotel and the El Pomar Foundation. And that was Thayer Sr. And the connection there perhaps was that the Broadmoor owned the Cog Railway. And Spencer Penrose, who started the Broadmoor, also owned the Pikes Peak Highway at one time. And of course, my family was over on Pikes Peak, and so when Thayer Tutt and the Broadmoor decided to sell the Crest House in 1956, my grandmother bought it. In those days, we owned the building. In 1968, the 30-year permit that was given with the ground on top of Mount Evans to the Mount Evans Company, the guys that built it, Davis, Newton, and Tutt, that permit needed to be renewed. The Forest Service said, as I remember, I was only 14 at the time, but I remember my parents saying that they didn't want, they wouldn't give us a lease on the ground, that they were going to take that building, but lease it back to us. And so my parents, being that generation that didn't much argue with the government, accepted that, and we leased the Crest House back. So the point in my mind being is that the Forest Service never had a nickel in the Crest House. They didn't build it. They didn't maintain it. The years we were running it, they collect some rent from it. And then in 68, they grabbed it without any compensation to anybody. And we rented it, we leased it from them, or they leased it to us, I should say, until the day it burned. Because we didn't own it, we didn't get to collect that money for the insurance, and the Forest Service did. So we really felt righteous in saying that building needed to be rebuilt, because we knew that they didn't have any money in it. We knew that it was an important asset up there. At that time, there were no cell phones, so we were very important to public safety up there. Anytime somebody was having medical problems, hit by lightning, stuck in the 6 inches of hailstorms, drive off the road at midnight, we seemed to always get the call. That's why I had to become an EMT. There was just that much of it, and then they even made me a deputy up there, so I had the sheriff's office radio. So we were the first to know and really the first to respond up there most of the time. Well, anyway, we go through the lawsuit of Forest Service, do the right thing, do the right thing, and do what the law says. We lost, but we knew we were right. So we got involved with a thing called Mountain States Legal Foundation that tries to protect landowner rights and that type of thing, based here in Denver. And they represented us on the appeal, and we won the appeal to require that the Forest Service rebuild the Crest House, just that they spend the money on Mount Evans somewhere. And so it was that situation of winning the battle but losing the war.
What did they end up spending it on?
I couldn't tell you. It could be the toll gate. It could be the A-frame at Bristlecone Pines, or it might even be the wind viewing, the platform that they made it, the ruins of the Crest House from. It could be. I can't say how you could spend $600,000 in those days on any of those projects, but who am I? And so anyway, that's where she stands. And then after that, of course, they had the fee demo program, which was when they started charging for the Mount Evans Road. And that didn't sound like a good name, so now it's called, it's been through 3 names, I can't remember So the Forest Service, the way it stands now, is that the United States Forest Service, that does not own the Mount Evans Highway, Colorado State 5. It's owned by the state of Colorado. It's maintained by the state of Colorado. It's opened and closed and plowed and patched by the state of Colorado. Funded through our gasoline taxes. But for whatever reason, the Forest Service gets to collect a fee, they call it. They don't call it a toll, they call it a fee. And that was challenged by the, what do they call that? The Western States No Fee Coalition, I believe, out of Durango. And sure enough, they cannot charge a fee for using the highway because it's a state highway. It doesn't belong to the Forest Service. But they can charge a fee for an outhouse, a picnic table, a parking lot, or a ranger of which to ask questions. So if you just want to drive to the top of Mount Evans and not use any of those amenities, drive to the top, turn around and come back down, that is described in a real small sign up there at the toll gate. But that's
Very small.
That's it. It's about what I know.
All right.